We are studying today we are studying today what is called the intertestamental period. And I'll explain that a little bit more just in case you don't know in a few moments. It is why I'm on a stool this morning. I've had a couple already ask me if something was wrong with me since I was sitting down. No, I have notes today. I have 7 pages of notes, and if I start walking around, I'm not going to follow those notes, and we're not going to cover everything. So I figure if I put a stool up here, I'm going to and we'll stay closer to my notes, and maybe things will go better in the class. Let me go through our prayer list this morning, and then Gene will lead us in prayer. And pretty much everything I have is in the bulletin, although there are some updates. Certainly we want to keep in our prayers all of those who are dealing and have dealt with the Hurricane Ian. In that regard, we have been able to make contact with Ted Wheeler. He is the preacher at Venice on the West Coast, and there is a truck, at least one truck, that's going to be there, a semi-truck that's going to be there Wednesday morning from Church of Christ Disaster Relief in Nashville. And if you remember back in 04 and 05 when we did that, that's about 80,000 pounds of supplies to distribute to the community. So Greg is organizing a group to go over to help unload that and distribute that, as well as to do other things that can be done to help in the recovery effort. I know that, for example, they've requested 5 sheets of drywall and somebody to actually put them in. They don't have to finish them, but it would be good to put them in if they could. They've requested some people with chainsaws. So if you're able to go Wednesday, he said he would try to leave early Wednesday morning and be back Wednesday night. Not in time for services, but certainly be back Wednesday night. So if you can take the day and go to help with that, or if you have chainsaw or truck or something like that, talk to Greg this morning. Or today, he's going to try to organize all of that and those efforts for Wednesday. But certainly keep all of those that are dealing with that in your prayers. You know what it's like. Many of you who have been here long enough to go through those storms, some of you, this was your first experience. And our side was rougher than I expected, wasn't it? Windy, yeah. Yeah, so certainly keep them in your prayers. Also, all of those who are dealing with COVID or this respiratory thing that's going around similar to COVID, if you were here last Sunday morning, I announced that we had at least 9 cases, and there were several that were possible. Well, a lot of those are coming back now, so we're improving, and at this point, I think that most everybody who had it is in a very good place and may be able to be back in society again. Wayne and Betty Preble are recovering. Gloria continues to recover from her recent surgery and infections. Barbara Jordan continues to improve. Judy Sadler has shown some slight improvement. They have changed the way that they are treating her, and they're trying to kind of minimize some of her sedation. And so they're hoping maybe today that they'll get a little more response out of her. Yesterday, she, at commands or requests or whatever, she did move her toes and fingers, and so that was certainly a good improvement. But she is still very, very sick, still in ICU, and still needs no visitors at this time. Austin Petty continues to take his daily chemo pills. He'll have the scans on the 24th. Susan Bobo's continuing to have health issues. Sue Evans' son Steve is dealing with colon cancer. Steve Jordan has some tests that he's got coming up. And Lisa Kirkwood continues to deal with some of the complications from her recent sickness with her eye and then following eye surgery as well. So that hasn't significantly improved yet, but it is improving. All right, is there anybody else? Yes. Okay, when does he start his chemo, do you know? Okay, if you didn't hear that, tomorrow Steve will get a port that will be in prep for his for the chemo treatments that'll follow. All right, anybody else? Is Don improving? Okay. Okay, if there's nothing else, then Gene will lead us in prayer and we'll get started. Okay, I guess I should have mentioned a while ago, I'll do this now. Obviously, we finished the Old Testament in our chronological study. If you've been a part of that, you know that we finished that last Sunday morning, which means you need a new schedule. And I have that schedule. It's just with all of the events that occurred this week, I wasn't in the office very often, and so there's one copy on my desk that hasn't been copied. And so I'll have it Wednesday night for you. But if you're preparing for Wednesday night, we'll be in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3 on Wednesday night. Not the whole chapters or anything, but if you'll study those chapters, then you'll be prepared for the class on Wednesday evening. And I'll have the schedule to follow up the subsequent weeks on Wednesday night as well, hopefully. This morning, we are studying what is commonly referred to as the intertestamental period, meaning this is not technically a Bible class. And some would say at that point, if it's not a Bible class, then why study it? And I think there are several reasons to do so. The primary reason I would say that we should do so is because it helps us to understand why things are the way that they are when Jesus arrives on the earth. You see, there's this period of time that Amos had prophesied would come, because what God knew is when the Israelites would come back from their captivity, which they did, and you remember in our recent classes there were 3 returns led by Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah, and they were there for quite some time before, well, even in the days of Nehemiah, we had the prophet Malachi prophesying at that point, but they were there for a good bit of time trying to remain faithful to God. They came back without a whole lot of knowledge of God's law, and so they messed up in some ways, but they wanted to do the right thing, and they were trying to do the right thing, and so they had help in doing so, and God provided for them prophets and others to help them along that way. But over the course of time, they kind of returned back to some of the habits that they had before they went into captivity. Not all of it was their fault, and we'll talk about that as I go through this period of time, but they went back to this direction away from God. And so Amos, because God knew that was going to happen, prophesied before they ever got there that there would be this period of time that he called, in his prophecy, a famine of God's word. And what that means is God wasn't going to be speaking to them anymore. You know, he wasn't going to be sending prophets. You remember in the book of Hebrews, the Hebrews begins by talking about in the times past, God spoke to the fathers and he spoke through prophets. But now, talking about the New Testament, he speaks through his Son. So they lived during this time in which God spoke to the fathers, or the patriarchal period, or through the prophets. And so that's how God communicated with them and guided them and gave them the direction that they needed to have. But this 400-year period of time, they didn't have that anymore. They got to a place where God finally said, you know, this is the end. This is all you're going to get. You have shown that you do not have a desire to follow me. You've shown that you do not have a desire to know what I want you to do. And so I'm just going to leave you to your ways. Romans chapter 1 talks about what those ways were a little bit. I'm going to leave you to your ways, and then the Messiah is going to show up. So they're back in the land now, and they're struggling. Now, before we go into that period, though, I want to deal with this. I realize this class is not going to be for everybody. Some of you are going to finish this class and say, what a waste of time. And that's okay. That's okay if you do that. I think there are some that didn't even want to study the Old Testament. But I want you to understand why this is important, especially the Old Testament. I don't live under the Old Testament. I don't have the restriction of traveling to Jerusalem 3 times every year. I don't have the daily sacrificial system that I have to go through. I don't have a priesthood that's set up the way that they had it, where I've got to approach them and all that kind of things. I don't have the land inheritance kind of restrictions and all dietary restrictions. Well, I'm thankful for that one. So people say, well, why in the world do we even study it? If we live under new, why even study it? And it's ironic to be in that place where you really question that, because I think it is so rich. The Old Testament is so rich, because when I study through the Old Testament, and Paul even talked about that more than once, about the fact that these things that were written before, these Old Testament accounts, are vital for us because they are an example. You know, and so when you've heard me say this before, when I read in the New Testament about the importance of walking by faith, I get to a place like Hebrews chapter 11 where all these names are listed and it tells me what it looks like to walk by faith. But if I go back into the Old Testament, I see what those names actually did, you know? I see what was represented in their lives, and I learned lessons. All throughout the Old Testament, I learned lessons about man, and we're not a lot different, by the way, if any different. And I learned lessons about God. I learned that no matter when you're living, whether they lived like Noah did back in the patriarchal age before the law of Moses, or Abraham, or like in the days of Moses when he was older and Israel was given the laws, or the days of Joshua when they're under the law, or any of those prophets, or if I live today under this new covenant, as Christians do from the day of Pentecost onward, no matter when you live in time, there is a principle. And that principle is that God reveals to us how to honor Him. And if He reveals to us how to honor Him, then we get from these examples what it looks like when we do and what it looks like when we don't. And so these Old Testament accounts are significant. Now, as you get into this 400-year period that is the intertestamental period, that is our class today, things dramatically change. And we don't have God recording for us these events. And so what we have is not inspired, so you can't trust that it's completely inspired. It's not inspired. You can't trust that it's completely accurate. It's historical. But you see pieces of what happened as people got further and further away from God's law. And then all of a sudden what you have is you have a group of people who about 400 BC, just after Malachi's prophecy, look one way, and then you have them at the beginning of the 1st century AD, and they don't look the same anymore. For example, you know that when Israel captured the land of Canaan, that they divided out that land, yet they were one nation, weren't they? We even call it the United Kingdom period. Yet 120 years after they get their first king, which they asked God for because they rejected God, not Samuel, but 120 years after they got that first king, they're no longer a united kingdom, are they? And what do we call them then? It's a divided kingdom. That ought to be simple. They're divided. And no longer are they just Israel. They are Israel and Judah. They're divided. Yet when they go into captivity, they go divided. You know, the Assyrians capture the north in 722. The Babylonians capture the south in 605, 597, 586. When they come back to captivity, are they still divided? Back from captivity, are they still divided? They're not. They come back as a unit. They're just Israel again. They're not even recognizing some of the things of their past. And by the time of the end of Malachi, they're still united for the most part. They're turning away from God, but they're still just one group of people. But you get to the New Testament, and it's not like that anymore. You get to the New Testament, and basically you find 6 primary divisions of the Jews. There are more. There are some small divisions, but there are 6 primary divisions. And I'll get to those in just a minute. And I told you I was sitting on this stool so I would stay with my notes, and I have no idea where I am in my notes. So the stool didn't help a whole lot. Yes? All that He's revealed to us. That's right. That's right. Yeah, all about Him and all that He's revealed to us. And that's the only way we can know about Him, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, so we're dealing with this beginning of this 400-year period. I want to back up before we understand, before we really jump into this. You remember in Daniel chapter 2, Daniel is one of those who was originally carried away to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar, right? And during this time that he is serving with Nebuchadnezzar, he becomes very elevated in the kingdom because he's faithful. He's faithful to God, and his integrity shows through to this pagan king, whom eventually he would influence significantly. But in Daniel 2, this king has had a dream about this image, and we discussed it quite a bit, not only when we studied Daniel 2, but in the events that followed. But the purpose of this dream that was given to Nebuchadnezzar was not so that he would, have trouble or learn anything about Daniel. It was about knowing the future. And so there were kingdoms coming, 4 primary kingdoms. Babylon was the first, and that was obviously Nebuchadnezzar, but they would be overcome by the Medes and Persians, and then they would be overcome by the Greeks, and they would be overcome by the Romans. And then Daniel said during the days of these Roman kings is when God would establish His kingdom, right? So that covers more than that 400-year period, but it does cover or include that 400-year intertestamental period. But for the Jews, there were not just 4 kingdoms. See, especially as it related to the Greeks, there were kind of sub-kingdoms The Greeks kind of controlled the world, but there were sub-kingdoms. And I'll tell you how this worked. Alexander the Great, you know who that was. Alexander the Great came into power with the Greeks at 20 years old. He reigned for approximately 12 years, so he was there until he was 32 years old. And it was Alexander the Great. The one thing that everybody remembers learning about Alexander the Great is he was so powerful that after he had gone on all of his campaigns, that it was said of him that he sat down and cried because he didn't have any more nations to conquer, right? Anybody besides me taught that when you were going through school? Yeah. I mean, the Greeks just took everything. But what you don't really usually study in school is that part of the historical record tells us that Alexander actually approached Jerusalem. You know, in his conquest, he approached Jerusalem, and he was prepared to conquer Jerusalem and Judea and destroy the city of Jerusalem. And as he was approaching the city, there was a group of priests that came out, the high priest, along with some other priests, came out of the city and met him. And they had on all of their priestly garb that was designated according to the Old Covenant. And they came out to meet him, and the high priest begged him not to attack the city of Jerusalem, not to destroy Jerusalem. And Alexander basically responded by saying, paraphrase, he basically responded by saying, a couple nights ago I had a dream that you were going to come out and meet me and tell me this. And he was so motivated by the fact that he had had this dream and now here the priest stood before him that he did not attack Jerusalem. He did not, in all of his conquests, he did not attack and destroy the city of Jerusalem. He was so impressed by that. And they opened up the prophets to him. After he started listening, they opened up the prophets. For example, they opened up the book of Daniel. And they went to Daniel chapter 2, and they talked about that image and how that God had said so many years earlier that the Greeks would come into power. And here you are. And so they were trying to tell him something about God, and he listened. And I'm not saying that Alexander the Great was in any way, shape, or form committed to God or even acknowledging God, but in his superstitious, quote, religious ways, he did acknowledge that Israel had a God that had done some things that he did not have the ability to explain. And so that affected the way that he treated the Jews, and he treated them favorably, and so they survived. But during this time, they were also divided up into four generals, I guess, or four areas. I guess when Alexander died, there were four generals that were put into place, and they were kind of connected to the Egyptians. So they went from the Greek period, Alexander period, to the Egyptian period, or so forth. There's not a lot that we know about that period. But following that was what we would call the Syrian period. And the reason this one is important is because not only did God talk about some of the things that were going to happen when they got to that time frame, but it also helps to explain what we find when we get to the New Testament. This was a terrible, terrible time for the Jews. Antiochus Epiphanes came into power with the Syrians, and he was the one responsible for their particular area of the world. And he hated the Jews. He hated the Jews so much that he would like to have eliminated them, and he put them very much under his power. And he desecrated the temple. He took, on the altar, he sacrificed a pig. And somebody might say, well, I don't understand why that's so terrible. The reason that's so terrible is because a pig was an unclean animal. They weren't supposed to touch it. They were not supposed to eat it. And the idol, or the altar rather, is supposed to be sanctified to God. So you take that desecrated, unclean pig to God's altar and sacrifice, you defile it. Oh, and by the way, Daniel had prophesied it would happen. He called it the abomination of desolation because it was an abomination that just destroyed all that they had hoped to do in approaching God. Also, Antiochus Epiphanes found all of their copies of the law, and there were people that were responsible for making these copies, so they were available. He found all of those copies of the law, and he destroyed most of them so the people couldn't have them anymore. And the ones that remained, he stamped idols, images of idols, on the pages of the scrolls and things so that they were no longer usable. And so because of that, idolatry came significantly back into the area of the Jews. That all happened, I guess the sacrifice on the altar happened about 164 BC. Not that date is going to matter to you. But following that, You know what? You just can't deal with that kind of oppression forever, right? And so as things got worse and worse and worse under Antiochus Epiphanes and others, finally there were people who had just gone as far as they were going to go. And so they were going to stand up and they were going to oppose the oppressors of Israel, and that took Israel into what is today called the Maccabean period. Some of you may have heard of the Maccabean period. That became pretty significant and is, even today, still a pretty significant period for those who continue today to practice modern Judaism. But the Maccabean period started with a man by the name of Matthias Maccabeus. And he was a priest, and he was old, and he decided he was tired of what was happening to his people. His son's name was Judas Maccabeus. So this Matthias Maccabeus, he decided in being so tired of it that he was going to act. And what he did is he actually executed, he killed a Syrian commander. Well, that's like poking the proverbial hornet's nest, right? That's not going to go well. And so, just like what happened so many years earlier when Moses slew the Egyptian, what happened to him? Did that go well? What happened to him? He ran off into the wilderness, didn't he? He had to. Well, when Matthias Maccabeus slew this Syrian commander, same thing happened. It didn't go well, and so he had to flee, and he fled off into the caves, and he took his sons with him, Judas being one of those, Judas Maccabeus. He's the one that would carry on his dad's hopes and wishes, I guess. So they run off into the caves, but listen, just like every time we went through these Old Testament accounts and we saw how bad things got with Israel, didn't we always see a remnant? I mean, even when the whole nation's we've got Ahab, the king in the north, and he's got 400 prophets telling him something contrary to God. Wasn't there one guy over there that would tell him the truth? Yeah, and that's that remnant. So there's a remnant now, even during this time frame when all this idolatry is so bad, the Maccabean period. And there are other of the Jews who followed Matthias and Judas out into the caves. And what ended up happening was there was a battle. And they fought and they defended themselves and they won. And they began to develop a military. And they used that military kind of in a guerrilla-style warfare to go back into individual cities, and they would attack, and they would defeat the Syrians in that city, and then they would go back to their caves, and then they would go to another area, and they would defeat the Syrians in that city. And they even went so far as not just to drive the Syrians out into little pieces at a time, but they found those Jews who had relented and given up their faith and given up following God and had changed over to the Syrian way of life. They executed those people. And so very rapidly what ended up happening was, especially Judas Maccabeus, led them back to a place to where they could potentially be united again. Then came the Romans, 63 BC. It's less than a century before Jesus would be on the face of the earth. They also divided the land. They did not, they were like the Greeks. It wasn't that they could just control everything from Rome. So they had these kind of sub-areas that were under Roman control, but these sub-areas were governed by others. And the one that becomes significant as our purpose for the Jews were the Herods. The Romans set up these individuals called the Herods. And the Herod that you're most familiar with is the one in the early parts of the New Testament is Herod the Great. So Herod the Great, not being a Jew, but being established by the Romans to govern the Jews, likes his job. And so as a true politician, he wants to make sure that he keeps the people happy enough that he can keep his job. And so in the beginning, he marries a Jewish woman. He thinks that will help in all of this integration, if you will. He provides money to build the temple and labor and things of that nature to build this temple back for the Jews so that they have what they want. And he really puts money and pride and all of this into helping the Jews so that he becomes very popular. I mean, he gives them everything they want. He's popular, right? But here's the thing. I don't care who you are. You can't be a hypocrite forever. You can't be a politician forever. Eventually, your true self will come out. And that's what happened with Herod. He started feeling more and more pressure, and you just can't keep up. If you're just doing things just to please people, well, when that one thing quits pleasing them, you got to come up with something else, right? And so he just couldn't keep that up, and eventually, well, it comes out. His true self comes out. And the first thing he did was he killed all of his brothers-in-law, who were Jews. He killed all of them, and then he killed his wife, presumably because, well, she was probably opposed to his killing of her brothers, right? So he kills his wife. Then he kills his mother-in-law, who I would presume was probably not happy with any of the people that he'd already killed, and so he killed her as well. And then he killed his brothers. So if he can't keep his position by pleasing the Jews so much, he'll just kill everybody who's potentially going to be a contender with him. Sounds kind of familiar to some of those Old Testament kings, doesn't it? Yeah. That's the same man that was proclaimed King of the Jews and in power in Matthew chapter 1 and Matthew chapter 2, when you have a child that's born in the city of Bethlehem, and wise men are going to see him, and this king says, "Tell me where he is that I may go worship him." That's the same man. I think you know by that point he wasn't really wanting to worship Messiah, was he? It's also the same man that upon learning where this is all coming down, that he went to Bethlehem and had all male children under the age of 2 put to death in the hopes of eliminating a challenger to the throne in his mind. Of course, Jesus wasn't coming to sit on a literal throne over the reign of the Jews, was he? He was coming to establish the kingdom that would be established in the days of the Roman Empire, according to Daniel chapter 2. But this king didn't understand this Herod. Now, that was very quick. I did it that quick because I didn't want to lose you. I was hoping that most of you would still be paying attention. Because the reason that we go through that, the reason I chose to go through all of that is because I want to know what it means. You know, I don't just want to know the history. I like history. I know that not everybody does, but I like studying history. I think it's exciting. But what I want to know is what about that history what was the effect that history had on the people? And especially as it relates to our purposes today, I want to know what effect it had on the Jews. And so in order to understand that, I've got to emphasize again that when Malachi's prophecy ended, the people were primarily united. I mean, they were just Israel. But by the time you get Jesus on the face of the earth and you've got this ministry of John the Immerser, we start reading about people. Like we read about the scribes, and they existed before, but I mean, Ezra was a scribe, wasn't he? But they looked different in the early part of the New Testament. You start reading about the Pharisees. Well, they're not mentioned in the Old Testament, are they? Where did they come from? The Sadducees, the Essenes, the Herodians, the Zealots. And we got all these different divisions, if you will, of the Jews. And they all have different directions. They all have different ideas on how to deal with God and how to deal with mankind. And I kind of need to know where that came from so that I can understand. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to be blunt. If you fall asleep in a little while, you're going to have the opportunity to get mad at me, and you're going to miss it. Because I'm going to say some things that's going to make some people angry. I want you to know that people are not different today than they were then. We are affected and respond to events around us in the world the same way they did. And we end up making the same mistakes that they made. So I don't want to end up in this place. Let me ask you this. In Acts chapter 2, when the gospel is proclaimed, 3,000 people obey the gospel. In Acts 2:47, they are added to the church. Singular, right? Okay? And it's still singular for all of the recorded New Testament period. When somebody came up and, like for example, when Philip is teaching the eunuch in the chariot and he says, "Here's water, what hinders me from being baptized?" And he baptized him. Do we read at any point where Philip spoke to the eunuch and said, "Now when you go back home, you look around and pick a church"? Did he say that? You know why not? There were no options. There was just the church that belonged to Jesus, right? Okay, so is that what it looks like today? That's because the events of our world have impacted people, and we divide. When that happens, we divide. So I want to know how these people got there. And I've only got 14 minutes, so I guess I better be a little quicker than I am. Let's talk about the scribes first. And like I said, the scribes did exist during the days. Ezra was a scribe. They did exist, but that was a job then, not a division. By the time you get to the New Testament, it's a group of people that are kind of divided. And if you were here when we studied through the book of Ezra and we talked about the scribes, you know that the job of a scribe was to copy God's law, right? Their job was to literally sit down with a papyrus or whatever, a scroll, and with the ink, they were to actually take an old scroll and copy it into a new one so that people had access. Because when they returned back from captivity, they had nothing. They didn't have a temple. They didn't have a city. They didn't have houses. They didn't have farms. They didn't have vineyards. They had God's law, but they didn't know it. And so these scribes had the responsibility of continuously copying this, so the law of God was made available to the people. But here's what happens with that. Well, if you sit and write something over and over and over, if I were to say to you, listen, you got a job. For the next 10 years, I just want you to, nothing, I'm going to pay you. I'm going to pay your salary. And for the next 10 years, 8 hours every day, 5 days a week, I want you to sit down and I want you to write out the book of Genesis. However much you can get done in 8 hours, you just keep doing it. When you get done, get another paper, start over again. Do that every day for 10 years. I bet you at the end of that 10 years, you'd know something about the book of Genesis, wouldn't you? And so these scribes were like that. They had a good knowledge of God's law. Here's what happened. The people that didn't have a good knowledge of God's law looked at the scribes and thought, wow, they are super spiritual people. They're more knowledgeable. I got to go through them to go to God. And so the people elevated them, and I'll tell you something. You start getting people praising your name and telling you how wonderful you are, you'll start believing it. And if you start believing it, well, here's what happened with them. This category fits too many preachers today. Here's what happened to them. They started not just copying God's law, but writing their own materials. And because it wasn't good enough for me to say to you, God says you got to keep the Sabbath. I got to tell you what I think that means. And so they added and added and added through their writings things to God's law. And what happened was their writings, because God was not speaking in that 400 years period, and the scribes were, their writings began to be elevated not only equal to God's law, but above it. And so you get to Matthew chapter 23, and you have Jesus saying, beware of the scribes and Pharisees, and I'll talk about the Pharisees in a minute. But he said, they bind heavy burdens on you. Those writings the Jews called the Talmud. They were the writings and the oral traditions of the scribes. So if a scribe said something, and that's why when you get to the Sermon on the Mount, what you have is Jesus saying things like, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, he wasn't referencing the old law, he was referencing the writings of the scribes. What they said is, God's law said, nationally speaking, justice is demanded, an eye for an eye. So you're a murderer, well, the law said you're to be put to death. The scribes said, well, I could do that personally. So if you irritate me enough, I can get even. And so Jesus says, well, that's what you heard, but that's not what God said. So you see, their writings became so important that they were higher than even God's word. So that's a division that suddenly developed by the time Jesus shows up. That's why they oppose him, right? He's not going to stick with their writings. That second group was the Pharisees. And again, I got to figure out where I am in my notes. The Pharisees. When this 400-year period of the intertestamental, when the intertestamental period began, the Jews are in their homeland, but again, they're under Persian rule. They're not on their own, right? And so the Persians had to make sure that there were people who would keep the peace. They had to make sure that there was somebody in charge that would make sure that the Persians are getting their taxes, right? And that the people in the land are doing what the Persians want them to do. And that continued even with the Greeks and the Romans too, by the way. That's what the Herods did. But this started really during the period of the Persians. And the person that was selected to do that was the high priest. Okay? Now what happened because of that is you had a conflict. Because you have the scribes who the people look at and they say, well, these guys are our spiritual leaders because they know everything. And then you have the high priest who is the political leader to the Persians. So you have a division that already has started to exist, and that affects the people. And so a conflict that would never be bridged in the rest of the history of the Jews developed. The people wanted to follow the scribes. The leaders of the land wanted to follow the high priest. That would end up being a group called the Sadducees, and I'll talk about them in just a minute. But the Pharisees, they were not wealthy. They were the common people, generally speaking. It's not a bad thing, but it does put them, in a sense, politically contrary to those who are different than them. But the problem with the Pharisees is, since they supported the scribes as the leaders, they bought into all these extra laws. And they were the ones that promoted the scribes to everybody else, and they were the ones that took the position kind of as the enforcers. So the scribes wrote what you were supposed to do, and the Pharisees enforced what the scribes said you were supposed to do. And so again, we get back to the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus was saying, you've heard it said. Well, the scribes said it, but it was the Pharisees that made everybody follow it. They ended up being very strict at doing things on the outside without changing their hearts, which I talked about a moment ago with Herod. If you're pretending, it's not going to last forever, right? Okay, then the Sadducees. And I've already told you something about them. These are the ones that believed that the high priest connected to Persia was supposed to be the leader, not the scribes. And they were very wealthy. These were, generally speaking, the very wealthy people. And what ended up happening was they gained their wealth because of the Greek culture. And so they really tied into the Greek culture and customs and intelligence and training and wealth. And so as a result of that, they found things in the Old Testament that they didn't like. Like, for example, not charging usury to those who were in need, or helping the poor or the outcast. They didn't like those things. And so they changed it, and they decided that the only thing you had to follow was the Pentateuch, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And they said, that's God's law. We can reject the rest of it. And as a consequence of that, there are many things that are found in the prophets that aren't so powerfully taught in the first 5 books of the Old Testament that they ended up rejecting. Like, for example, they didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. They did not believe in angels. And quite frankly, since most of the prophecies of the Messiah found in the Old Testament are after the book of Deuteronomy, they didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah when he showed up. They didn't think there was any evidence. And so they rejected him. Another group is the Essenes. The Essenes are the only one of the 6 major divisions of the Jews that's not found in the New Testament. The only reason we know about them is because of historical records and the things that we have found, like, for example, things like the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those people were the Essenes. See, they became communal. Here's what happened, and this is where these last 3 that I'm going to be very quick on is where I'm going to make you mad. These are the reactionary people. They saw what was happening in Jewish society, and this group's, the scribes are up here, and these people they're fighting and they're divided, and so we're going to solve all this. We're going to reject everybody. And so you had to be in a scene, you had to sell everything you had and put it in this community pool, and everybody kind of lived in this communal place, and you couldn't even eat food that wasn't prepared by an Essene. I mean, we're just going to reject everybody. Now, the benefit to having those people around is they did a pretty good job of keeping copies of scrolls and things like that, but they didn't impact anybody in the world, and we don't even read about them in the Bible. Then came the Herodians, and I think their name pretty well explains who they were, right? They were supporters of the Herods. They were nationalists, you might call them. They believed in the political power, and they believed that the political power would save the Jews. If we only had the right political power, they'll save the Jews, and they would not question anything about the political power, no matter what they said. If Herod said to them, you need to do this, and that's contrary to God's law, they didn't care. They would do what Herod said, and frankly, they wouldn't listen to anybody that said it wasn't according to God's law. Now, you want to be mad? Here it comes. The last election, I paid attention and listened. And I listened to people say things like, if you're a true Christian, you're going to support Donald Trump. Or if you're a true Christian, you're going to support Joe Biden. And what happened is, churches divided. because for some reason we believed that a political person was going to be our Savior. Well, at the risk of making you mad, maybe you need to be mad, there's only one Savior to the church, and he's not running for the presidency. He's a Messiah. He's the king of this kingdom. And no matter what happens in our government or any other government, we can't let the circumstances of society take us to a place where we put more trust in a man or any person than our God. That was the Herodians. Well, obviously, they're going to oppose Jesus, right? Because he said, my kingdom is not of this world. Then there was the Zealots. And the Zealots are also in existence today, in more ways than most people like to apply it. The Zealots were the people who would oppose all political guide or rule or whatever. They would be the terrorist of their day. You know, they would be like, the easy application is they would be like what happens in the Middle East, where if somebody finds out you're a Christian, they just might put you to death. Okay, that's the easy application, but there's more application than that. And by the way, Simon, one of the apostles, used to be a zealot. That's what he was before he was an apostle. That's Acts chapter 1 and verse 13. Oh, and Matthew, by the way, was a tax collector, so he was a government employee, and Simon's a zealot. Probably had some different viewpoints, don't you think? Yeah, but here's the thing. The Zealots are the kind of people, let me find my notes. I want to make sure I say this the right way. If I'm going to make you mad, I might as well do it right? Okay, the Zealots, in application to us today, is what I want to say this. The Zealots will attack anybody who opposes their viewpoint. Is that accurate description of our society today? If you don't agree with me, let's say this. Let's talk about the abortion issue, all right? If abortion becomes legal, well, a zealot attacks abortion clinics, shooting people, things like that. Okay, well, if abortion becomes illegal, well, a zealot attacks a pregnancy crisis center or an adoption center. I'm not going to pick on one side because we all are like this from time to time. We have so much zeal for our own political or intelligence in what we believe that anybody who thinks different than me is automatically not a divisive, but an enemy. So I'm going to oppose them. That's the world Jesus came into. That's the world he's in today. So the application, and I've got to quit with a prayer, is this. Society took the Jews to a place that they should not have gone, and quite frankly, didn't intend to go. We can't let society take us back there. It's going to take, society's going there. We're going there. We can't go with them. Okay? Wednesday night, Matthew 1 and Luke chapter 3. Let's close with a prayer. Father, we're so thankful for the opportunity to be here today, and we're so thankful for these accounts that help us to understand what happens when we choose to go our own way instead of your way. We're so thankful, Father, that we have these accounts in the Old Testament that give us examples of what it means to live by faith, and we pray, Father, that we'll have the strength to actually live that life. Help us to trust in you, not in ourselves, not in any other men, not even in our government. Help us to trust in you. Forgive us where we fail you. In Christ's name, amen.